Today we're going to be talking about symbiotic relationships. Symbiotic relationships occur in virtually every ecosystem, and they are really important for every ecosystem because without them, organisms aren't going to be able to get the materials, the resources, a lot of the things that they need come from the benefit of these symbiotic relationships. So we're going to be talking about the big three today. But before we do that, we'll go ahead and define what it means to have a symbiotic relationship. And it is any relationship in which two species live closely together. And it's a pretty broad definition because there's a couple different ways that they can interact with one another. Some positive, some negative, and some neutral. So we're going to look at those today. But the one key thing to take away from this is they have to be members of two different species. Otherwise, it doesn't qualify as symbiosis. So, for example, if it were two rabbits of the same species and they were in some way or another interacting, that is not symbiosis. It would have to be a rabbit and a squirrel somehow interacting with one another. Now, it could be, technically two different species of squirrel interacting with one another. But a lot of times, members of different species really don't want to interact with one another. In a lot of situations, if I'm a member of one species and you're a member of another, we don't have a lot in common, so we're not hanging out, right? Maybe this one's trying to eat that one, or vice versa. So in a lot of these situations, members of other species, they just kind of ignore one another, and kind of go about their business. And you got to think of that in terms of, as a human, right? You may have like a pet or something like that you interact with, but outside of a pet, you don't have a lot of interaction with organisms. You're not going out into the woods and squirrels are harvesting acorns for you or anything like that. There's other species that you're interacting with, but you don't really kind of forge relationships with those organisms. So other species are the same way. They're not, if they're not gaining something from it. And a lot of what you'll see in these, as we go through these, you'll see that some of these are simply unintentional. A lot of them are unintentional. These organisms don't have a desire to help one another. It's just, I'm going to do my thing and you're going to do your thing. And it just so happens that those two things, help us or help you or whatever the case may be. So the first one we're going to look at is what's called mutualism. Mutualism is where both species in the relationship benefit. So I call this a win-win, okay? And if you look at the term mutualism, I always try to remind my students, mutual, it is mutually beneficial, okay? It is good for both of these. So if I were to give you a real life example, be something along the lines of maybe you have a ticket to a concert, right? And you really want to go to that concert. And turns out you got this concert, you bought this ticket, and it turns out it's the same night as your grandparents' anniversary party, and you just can't go. Okay, but you got the ticket. And you have a friend who really wants to go to the concert, and they missed out on buying the ticket. But it just so happens that they happen to have an extra cell phone. They bought a cell phone, and it came with a buy one, get one free. And your cell phone breaks. You can't go to the concert, you're out of a cell phone. They really want to go to the concert, they have an extra cell phone. You can easily reach a mutually beneficial agreement, right? They give you the cell phone, you give them the ticket, both of you walk away happy, right? It's mutually beneficial. And that's what's happening in nature. Like I said though, in most of these scenarios, it's not a desire to make the other person happy, or it's not a desire to come to an agreement. It's simply two organisms doing what they do, and it just so happens that they both benefit. So there's lots of different relationships in nature of mutualism, and we're going to look at some of the big ones. Probably one of the most referred to cases of mutualism is the relationship that exists between pollinators and flowers. Okay? Flowers need to be pollinated. Okay? They have to be pollinated in order to produce seeds. So if we're looking at a flower, try to draw a little tulip here. Okay? This is our flower. And And this flower is going to do everything that it can to attract pollinators. It's brightly colored, it smells good, but the real key is this flower is going to produce nectar. Okay? Nectar is sweet and it is fuel for a lot of different organisms. There are birds that eat nectar, there are bees that eat nectar, there are butterflies and moths that consume nectar, so there's a lot of different things after this nectar. So they come to this flower wanting to pick up the nectar. But what happens is, in addition to nectar, these flowers have these little parts that stick up, and attached to these little parts is something called pollen. Okay? Pollen is the male reproductive cell of a flower. So when the bee comes in and says, "Oh boy, free food, I can't wait," okay? If you've ever looked at a bee up close, one thing you'll notice is they're kind of fuzzy, right? Now, maybe you said, "I don't want to get close to a bee," but if you've ever had the opportunity to look at one, you'll see that a bee is fuzzy. So when this bee buzzes along and it lands on this flower, it's going to get some nectar, but it's also going to inadvertently, this pollen is going to stick to that fuzzy little body of the bee. And that way, when this bee buzzes off and goes to another flower to get more nectar, that pollen that he collected on flower A will get transferred to flower B. Okay? So that's how pollination happens. And again, it's completely inadvertent. The bee wasn't like, "Oh, got to go get some pollen and help these plants out." It's just trying to get a meal. Okay? So, this bee wants the nectar, wants the food. In the process, picks up pollen, transfers pollen from flower A to flower B, and when this flower produces seeds, it is now producing seeds that are a combination of those two flowers. Sexual reproduction has taken place, which is what the plant wanted all along. Plants are really sneaky. We don't give them a lot of credit, but plants are really sneaky in getting other organisms to kind of do their bidding. So that's probably the most classic example of mutualism. Another example would be cleaner fish. Cleaner fish are small little fish that will swim inside the mouths of larger fish, especially like sharks and things like that, and they will clean between those sharks' teeth. So there's kind of an unspoken agreement there. The shark will open its mouth and agree not to eat the fish because it's just a little teeny tiny fish, right? And so the shark, to that, it would be even less than a snack. So that fish will actually go inside the shark's mouth and eat kind of leftover pieces of meat and things like that that may be stuck between its teeth. So that keeps its teeth nice and healthy, and in return, that cleaner fish gets a meal. So, and this happens not just with cleaner fish, but you also see sometimes birds that will ride on the back of animals like water buffalo and those types of things. They'll actually dig into the animal's back and dig out parasites and things like that. So they'll dig those out, eat them. They get a meal, and it keeps the other animals parasite free. Another example that I want to give here, because I want to use it in one of my other types, is imagine a squirrel living in an oak tree. Okay, so as we know, an oak tree produces acorns. So when a squirrel lives in an oak tree, it gets a place to live, and it can, make its little nest there somewhere in the tree. While it's living in that tree, it's also going to be gathering up acorns because the acorns are going to be falling all around. Squirrel is going to take those acorns and bury them everywhere. It's going to put some in a tree, it's going to bury some underground, and it's going to consume and pick up so many acorns, it has no idea where it left them all. They have some pretty simple brains. So in the process of living in the tree, they also spread those seeds all over the place. So squirrel gets a place to live, the tree gets its seeds spread all around. And again, remember that because we're going to talk about it again on our next example, which is called commensalism. Okay? So unlike mutualism, commensalism is where one of the species in this relationship benefits and the other is completely unaffected. Or sometimes we say the other is neither helped nor harmed. So there's no good, there's no bad, it's just kind of neutral. It's a neutral interaction. The most classic example that's always used here are barnacles and the whales that they attach themselves to. So if you've ever seen a video or an up-close image of a whale, you'll see that it has these bumpy little kind kind of suction things, or little organisms suction cup to it. Now, they don't suction cup and they don't leach anything from the whale. They're not stealing blood. They're not ticks or fleas or anything like that. They're simply just kind of suction cup to the underside of the whale. The reason they do that is barnacles are filter feeders. So they swim through the water attached to the whale, and they pass lots and lots of water through their body, and as they do, they pull out little bits and pieces of food, and that's how they feed. Now, if they're not attached to a whale, they have a really tough time moving themselves through the water. They're kind of at the mercy of the current. They just kind of float around. So they'll float around, and then until they come into contact with one of these larger organisms, they'll suction cup themselves to it, and then they just kind of hitch a ride for the rest of the time. They've also discovered, now this would not be symbiosis because the other thing involved in this is not an organism, but they've also involved that ships are really good for moving them around the ocean. So barnacles will attach themselves to the underside of ships, and that's why periodically you have to pull the ships and then clean them to get all the barnacles off so that it doesn't affect the way the ship moves through the water. So other relationships were commensalism. We'll get back to that squirrel and tree example. If a squirrel lives in a tree that is not an oak tree, let's say it's an elm tree, and the squirrel has no interest in those seeds, then now it becomes commensalism because the squirrel is getting a place to live, the tree is not being harmed because the squirrel is not really harming it by living there, and it is not spreading its seeds. So there's no good, no bad for the tree. It now becomes commensalism. So if you ever see that, you have to be careful and read the whole example because you can't just automatically jump and say, oh, squirrel in a tree. It's got to be mutualism. Because if it's not a tree where it's spreading seeds, then it becomes commensalism. The last type of symbiotic relationships is called parasitism. And in parasitism, this is the only one of the three where we have a negative impact. So one organism is going to benefit and the other is going to be negatively impacted. And so this is the type of relationship we see between a deer and a tick, a flea and its host, a leech and its host. So the organism that's doing the harm and receiving the benefit is the parasite, and the organism that is being harmed is the host. The trick to a good parasitic relationship is being able to live on your host or within your host and not be detected. And you also you want to make sure that you don't eliminate your host, because if I'm a leech and I just take so much blood from my host that the host dies, well, I'm dead too, right? So there's kind of finding that balance of, you got to take enough nutrients to stay alive, but you can't take so many that you kill your host, because once your host is dead, then that's your meal ticket and you don't have anything else to eat. So, and there are some plants that are capable of this. We have parasitic plants. It's usually plants that can't photosynthesize, because what's the point in being a parasitic plant if you can get your energy from the sun? Most of the plants that are parasitic, they cannot photosynthesize, and so they kind of dig into another plant that can and steal nutrients and water and those types of things. So again, the big three that we've discussed today are mutualism, where both species benefit, commensalism, where we have one species benefit and the other being unaffected, and parasitism, where we have one species benefiting and the other member of that relationship is being harmed.